Good evening and welcome to my talk. In 2020, I collaborated with Martina Miller on an essay with the aim to interpret my art through the lens of text readings. My presentation today is an adapted version of this catalog essay for the exhibition You Don't Hear Me at the Fundación Miro, which was in 2019. This catalog was linked to the 7th One Miro Prize that I received in 2019. My work since the late 1960s has focused on my presentations of women's plight and adverse destinies over the centuries, with special attention to the theme of silencing. The fact being that historically, women's voices, insights, and intuitions have been dismissed and brushed aside. Female thought has hardly had the chance to flourish and been taken seriously as a plausible alternative to predominant forms of often abusive patriarchal imaginaries. Additionally, over the decades, as an artist, I have tried to make visible the plight of the dispossessed, tribals, pavement dwellers, and the so-called lower rungs of the Indian community, especially Indian women, who have been oppressed fourfold due to caste, class, religion, and gender. Despite the closeness and directness with which I treat difficult subjects, it is important for me to cast a ray of light and transmit my deep belief in the positive aspects of human beings and in the possibility of the emancipation of the human species. In this process of giving meaning and presence to the dispossessed, literature, as well as critical theory readings, have always played a major role in my work. At times, they act as sources of inspiration or as additional layers of meaning, while at others, they create resonances of, or subvert inherited narratives. Attentive reading has been a daily part of my routine since I had my very first studio at the Bhulabhai Memorial Institute, Bombay, in 1964. But a major turning point in my relationship to written sources in my work came in 1979 when I met the British artist R.B. Kitai at one of his exhibitions in New York. There I saw an artwork titled If Not, Not, from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. On that occasion, Kitai said to me, "Some texts have artworks in them." Shortly thereafter, I came across the Greek concept of ekphrasis. That fateful meeting with Kitai and my thinking about ekphrasis encouraged me to use quotes from authors who were relevant for expanding the themes I was developing in my work. Since then, the inclusion of literary or philosophical excerpts has remained a constant in my practice. As a result, my sources have trickled into works as diverse as films, reverse paintings, shadow plays, video plays, animations, and ephemeral wall drawings. In this PowerPoint, I intend to examine the role certain key texts have played in my process of working. The writing on the wall. My museum solo exhibitions often include large charcoal wall drawings where I combine a series of monumental portraits and attributes in which are embedded a number of text quotes. These are, as I call them, city-specific wall drawings where I include a subject that is pertinent for that moment in that place. As a visual language, I developed a lexicon of images from different sources that can vary from an inner ear, American Sign Language, which very efficiently spells democracy, or the human spine. It is an ephemeral working method where studio and exhibition walls collapse, which I began exploring in 1992 with City of Desires at Gallery Chemould. There, I took over the entire White Cube Gallery in South Bombay as my studio. Here, I worked in situ on what I called at that time impermanent site-specific installation. What you see on the floor here is red oxide powder, and everybody walked out of the room with red oxide on their shoes. That project was a protest against the growing influence of right-wing nationalists and a tribute to the Jaipur mural artists in Nathdwara, whose works were being destroyed due to grave negligence on the part of the state. I identified with these artists in my way of working. The drawings were to be wiped off after 15 days in an erasure performance, such as these murals were gradually dying out. Since then, my wall drawings end with an erasure performance on the last day of the exhibition. In these wall drawings, I include quotes in English with additional quotes in the local language. So for instance, French at the Centre Pompidou in 2017, Italian at the Castello di Rivoli in 2018, Marathi at the Bhavdachi Art Museum in Mumbai, and Catalan at the Fundació Joan Miró in 2020. The text quotes in each case are placed inside the wall drawings as part of the city map, on the shoreline or following the map's main roads or twirling around the massive heads like ribbons in the wind. Examples of selected quotes are from the poems called Map and Nothing Twice by the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska, or Astia by the ancient Greek dramatist Aeschylus, and from Hannah Arendt, the quote, "To be alive means to live in a world that preceded one's own arrival and will survive one's own departure." And from Simone Weil, the quote, "The destruction of the past is perhaps the greatest of all crimes." These texts set the tone for the exhibition and reveal how I see myself as part of a larger cultural historical framework of resistance and responsibility where I must speak out. "You don't hear me" refers to the fact that historically women have not been listened to, not heard, that their voices have not been taken into account. This is why I am so drawn to the story of Cassandra's tragic gift. Her foresight was fatefully challenged with incredulousness from others, or more plausibly, with their resistance to hear and accept certain truths. Cassandra had the gift of prophecy, but was punished by Apollo because she refused his sexual advances. He spat in her mouth and cursed her so that nobody would ever believe her. I deplore the fact that now, more than ever, the world is ruled by egocentric male figures, present-day Apollos, who have no connection to nor any consideration for their own female side. I firmly believe that the only way humanity will make any regenerative progress is by listening to their female voices. Cassandra is directly linked in the ancient story to Aeschylus' version found in his 5th century BCE Orestia trilogy. But for me, Cassandra became more special due to the German author Christa Wolf's 1983 novel with the same title, Cassandra. In 2006, I found a used 1984 English version of Woolf's novel at a book market in Amsterdam. Inside the book, I found a picture postcard with an image of the Tholos of Delphi. On the verso, one woman is writing to another as follows. I took this with me to read on the plane to India, and it was quite extraordinary. I couldn't put it down. Then last week in Berlin, I found out that it's now a feminist cult book in Germany. Maybe you like it too. And it was signed E, 31 January 1985. Christa Wolf's version of Cassandra arrived at a time when I felt this myth was most resonant. I felt this myth was most resonant. The process of globalization in the early 21st century appeared similar to how the Greeks colonized Troy. For me, Cassandra's prophecies are metaphors for today's multinational extractivist capitalism and its dire effects that reach every part of our planet. Will human beings and nature survive this century? If only we were willing to listen to Cassandra's voice, the intuitive voice, the prophetic voice that all of us have, and act upon it, we might still be able to counter the destructive tide. Woolf's book is an account of the Trojan War, told from a female perspective. Cassandra was a Trojan princess who, partly because of her warnings and dissent, gradually lost her position and privileges to become an impotent witness to the demise of her own city. In addition to the shift in point of view of having a different storyteller recount that fateful war, the book is also interesting in that the conflict is told from the Trojan perspective. In the West, that war has been most often told from the perspective of the Greeks, as Europe has traditionally claimed Greece as part of its ancestry, especially when creating the fable of rationality as the base of its supposed superiority over other cultures. In Woolf's book, however, the Greek Achilles appears as an abusive, exceedingly violent monster, while Helen's abduction by Paris is shown to be a much more complex affair than we are usually made to believe. Christa Wolf's Cassandra departs from the accepted Western canon, from the official versions, and it acquires a global trans-historical dimension. In fact, it is described as a piece of what today we would call fake news, manipulative misinformation, which in that case helped trigger the confrontation between two rival peoples. The rest of the story is not only a tale of female suffering, but also of strength and clarity in the face of dire adversity. Cassandra has been one of my main topics since 2006 and has been put into different media besides the wall drawings to give it the visibility and importance she deserves as a primary theme in my work. In 2008, Cassandra became the main protagonist in the shadow play The Tables Have Turned, 2008, with 32 revolving cylinders, which was commissioned by the Sydney Biennale. While staring at the hypnotizing revolutions of the reverse paintings on the turntables and its shadow play, the voice of the actor Alaknanda Samarth recites an excerpt from Woolf's Cassandra and pulls us into the subject. The imagery comes from such diverse sources as Kalighat artists, Albrecht Dürer's woodcut of Cain and Abel, and 19th century drawings of inventions. The spoken text weaves all these words together in an unusual combination, inviting viewers to make new associations and storylines. This was followed in 2007 by Listening to the Shades, a 42-panel painting installation. The painting installation was the outcome of a collaborative art project started in 2006 with the curator Robert Storr. It was meant to be a storyboard for a film about Cassandra, for which I made 42 reverse paintings about the sense of doom I felt at that time. On the day Listening to the Shades was installed for the first time as a multi-painting environment with bright blue walls as part of a 2008 solo show in New York, Lehman Brothers collapsed. The biggest financial crisis since the Second World War had started. And to me, it felt like more than a coincidence that Cassandra's cautionary legacy was being exhibited right there at that very moment. The imagery of these paintings, again, has a wide range of references, central to which is the representation of women in different cultures over the centuries. Cassandra herself is depicted breathing life into the lower part of a backbone coming out of her mouth, while around her head, 2 brains are floating and a series of military jet planes maneuver dangerously. For Documenta 13 in 2012 in Kassel, I made my 4th and most complex video shadow play, consisting of 6 projections whose beam cross 5 reverse painting cylinders which rotate at 4 RPM. It was made in situ for the rear room of the Documenta Halle, which one descended into through a narrow sloping alley leading to a 10-meter high room. Here, the immersive video play was placed like a 360-degree video freeze above the heads of the viewers. The title and main text in this work comes from Agha Shahid Ali's translation, titled in English, In Search of Vanished Blood, from Faiz Ahmad Faiz's poem Lahu Ka Surag, written in Urdu in 1965. Faiz was a Pakistani left-wing intellectual and revolutionary poet who lived between 1911 and 1984. The 2 other sources of inspiration are Christa Wolf's Cassandra, a novel and 4 essays of 1983, and Rilke's The Notebooks of Malte Laurence Brigg, 1910. The soundtrack is inspired by a selection of texts from Heiner Müller's Hamlet Machine, Samuel Beckett's Krapp's Last Tape, and the short story Draupadi by the Indian social activist and writer Mahashweta Devi, translated by Gayatri Spivak. In Search of Vanished Blood creates a provoking space with seemingly endless combinations of video images, floating shadows, and a compelling soundscape revolving around complex themes such as the curse of the gift of prophecy, the fatal position of women, and the failure of human communication. Cassandra is the main protagonist who tells the story to which a chorus reacts about a deteriorating world in which she offers a way out if only we would listen and learn from the brutalities that have taken place in the past to create a new, more humane situation. The story of Cassandra, as well as other Greek tragedies, were part of my reading since the late 1960s, and old copies of these tales are still on my bookshelves. I had friends who were writers and poets with whom I discussed literary works from the Greek classics to more contemporary works. Greek tragedies were also part of the theater movement in Bombay at the time, especially at the Bhulabhai Memorial Institute, where I helped with theater productions. During those years, I attended the Sajidi School of Art in Bombay, which had 3 faculties, including architecture, in which my best friends were studying. They were incredibly devoted to the idea of the Bauhaus and attentive to the developments of different social strata in large urban areas and its effect on modern India. Along with the readings on the Bauhaus, I found in the library of the architecture department of the city's American Library the early Soviet avant-garde, including Tatlin and Lissitzky. Having studied graphic design in my first year, I helped these architecture students with the lettering and the construction of these maquettes. When I completed my studies at Sajidi School of Art in 1969, artist Akbar Padamsee opened the Vision Exchange workshop called VIEW. Here he invited artists from different disciplines to experiment with reproductive media such as film, photography, and print. Even before the photo cameras were brought to the workshop, I made a series of camera-less photographs in the dark room there. In that same period, architect Charles Curria frequently visited his friend Padamsee and would talk about his ideas for social housing for his projects in New Bombay. On one occasion, after Buckminster Fuller had given a lecture in New Delhi, Curria invited Buckminster Fuller to come to Bombay, where he gave a dinner for Fuller at his home, where coincidentally I sat next to the American visionary. His ideas were dazzling, and I still treasure the publication of his Delhi lecture that he presented to me and his book, Ideas and Integrities. Those exchanges of Curria and Buckminster Fuller are the background for my 8mm animation film, Dream Houses. During the summer of 1969, I started a labor-intensive stop-motion animation film on the idealism and hope that modernism brought in the Nehruvian period. I worked on this every day for nearly 2 months. Dream Houses thus became a color fantasy of a utopian urban landscape inspired by the color theories of Johannes Itten and the light space modulator of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. While working on this elaborate animation, I made the black and white 8mm film Still Life. The story was told only with objects, of which books formed an important part. At the beginning of the film, the camera enters a room and a number of publications are thrown on a bed. A close-up shows some of the titles, which include film Sense by Eisenstein, Gershein's A Concise History of Photography. Coming to the end of the film, the camera shows a 10-second sequence of flipping through Eisenstein's book before it ends with a shot of a turning ceiling fan. Later in 1969, I went to Paris to study on a French government scholarship for 2 years. As I often say, Paris became the university of my life. While I did not have the opportunity to make much art except a series of photographs in Paris, text, spoken and written, became more than ever a daily need and formed my future as a politically engaged artist. The influence of my time in Paris is implicit in all the works I would later produce. Upon my arrival, I went to the École des Beaux-Arts, where I was told the school was closed. The École was in the midst of a restructuring process to introduce new teaching methods about the student revolt in 1960, after the student revolt of 1968. Instead, I received a student card with which I could attend any classes and activities at the prestigious institutes in Paris. I attended a printmaking atelier, sat in lectures by Noam Chomsky and Claude Lévi-Strauss at the Sorbonne, was part of political Marxist meetings, and got involved with the initiatives of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Had discussions with students, especially from the colonized world, which were stimulating and eye-opening. The Marxist student groups saw the world's problems and independent and post-independent struggles as a priority. For them, making art was nothing more than a bourgeois activity. Besides this, I also frequently attended screenings and discussions at the Cinémathèque Française, where I met Jean-Luc Godard. The filmmaker was taking off for Palestine with his portable video camera to make films that were to be instruments of social and political resistance. We're still trying to do that, aren't we? Of the student's stipend I received, much was spent on used books. The used books I found at the bookshops in the left bank. All of these inputs turned everything I thought I knew upside down. Even my knowledge about India, as when an Indian friend gave me the manuscript of Homo Hierarchicus, Essai sur le système des castes, by anthropologist Louis Dumont, an in-depth investigation of the Indian caste system. After returning to India in 1975, I continued filming. In 1973, I made Taboo, a 16mm black and white film which deals with discrimination against women in India, justified by caste and religion. Taboo shows deceptively non-provocative images. However, with the final shot of this film on weavers in a small town in Rajasthan, the strict hierarchy that exists in the working process becomes quite clear. The low-end jobs, such as spinning, are performed by women, but under no circumstances are they allowed to touch the loom. Thus, they are excluded from the most important and creative part of the process, which is the exclusive domain of the male weavers. The second film, influenced by the readings and meetings in Paris, is Utopia, my first multi-screen work, meant to be exhibited with 2 film projectors. This format allowed me to juxtapose 2 positions, the idealism and hope that modernism brought to the Indian middle and lower classes in the Nehruvian period of the 60s, and the later dystopia of urbanism in the 70s. For this, I placed Dream Houses, the 8mm stop-motion color animation made in 69, adjacent to Utopia, made in 76, a 16mm black and white film from which I took the overall title for the double screen projection. The politically charged Utopia as a double projection is more than the sum of its individual films. By placing the utopian and the dystopian next to each other, it reaches another level when the disillusioned female dreamer and the dream merge into a single experience. In these early films of the late 60s and 70s, I took issue with the changings happening in Indian society under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and beyond. At the same time, my first animation, Dream Houses 69, shows an awareness of the formal possibilities offered by the European avant-garde. In fact, I usually describe myself as an internationalist, and my work can be said to be a very personal mix of literary and artistic sources, both Western and Asian, which I blend and turn into images in my paintings, installations, and animations. This is also evident in my early films, which focus on urban and rural context, as well as the social and economic transformations brought about by global trends during the Cold War and the dismantling of colonial territories. My work in the 21st century was shaped by the radical change in the late 80s. With the growing orthodoxy in politics in the 90s, I wished to speak to a wider public. Hence, I started to make room-filling wall drawings, shadow plays, theater, and again, the moving image, which was now available in a much cheaper format as video. The moving image uses a language with which the general audience in India is so familiar in all stratas of society. The second part of the strategy to reach a wider audience was my focus on retelling stories from different ages and cultures. An earlier example featuring both of these elements is my first multi-channel video installation, Remembering Toba Tek Singh. In 1998, India carried out the second underground test during their development of the nuclear bomb. My response to that controversial moment was this installation based on a well-known 1955 short story by Sadat Hasan Manto. His tragic comic Toba Tek Singh recounts the story of inmates from an asylum in Lahore who are taken to the new India following the 1947 partition. For me, Manto's book brilliantly illustrates the absurdity of the division of India into two countries. His vision regarding this and other major problems that still haunt the South Asian region is more relevant today than ever. For this type of installation, I coined the term video play, a play in which two actors only appear on video. Hence, I could travel this play easily, internationally, without the extreme costs of a real play. As such, video plays and later video shadow plays became key for my new media art in the 21st century, shown at international biennials and museum exhibitions. In a 6-month residency at the Fukuoka Asian Art Museum in 1999-2000, I made the video play Hamlet Machine. This work I based on the text of the play Hamlet Machine from the German playwright Heiner Müller, which he adapted from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Müller wanted Hamlet Machine to be read as a pamphlet against the delusions of innocence. He could be called a universal playwright, asking questions and expressing traumas that concern all contemporary humankind. My video play does not follow exactly the text of Hamlet Machine, as in Müller's play, but I make a selection, such as Müller's style of enigmatic fragmentary pieces. For this, I worked together with a Buto dancer, Haradav Nabuo. His meticulous control of the body was unique and ideal for me, using it as a screen for projecting videos, which were then recorded again on video. What interested me in this case is the Arto Brecht montage on an English play, which gets adapted for Germany and then for India with Japanese components as a video installation. My artistic need for retelling stories with a different female perspective opened up a completely new set of works, including reverse paintings. I had learned this unusual technique in 1988 from my friend Bhupen Khakkar, that he had, for his part, learned on a study trip to Eastern Europe. Reverse painting was known for a long time in India and had a rich history in sacred art, while it actually came to India as profane, erotic glass paintings sold by Chinese traders at the docks. I remixed the meanings again, and in 1999 created the shadow play, The Sacred and the Profane. At a time when fundamentalists took to sanitize Indian culture of all that is playful, sensuous, and pluralistic, I reworked the story of the Indian personage Sita, born from the earth, who bears cross-cultural similarities to a mythic female Greek alchemist. These cross-cultural ideas I could share and discuss with my friend Thomas McEvilley, the New York-based art critic and scholar, whom I met for the first time in Bombay in 1987. We were both from the very start interested in each other's projects, sharing common ground and lines of research. McEvilley's writings gave full academic expression to certain historical developments that had been clear to me through visual experience and direct observation during my travels in India and by studying its cultural history. Machiavelli's magnum opus, The Shape of Ancient Thought, Comparative Studies in Greek and Indian Philosophies, was the result of almost 40 years of trying to prove that ancient Greece and ancient South Asia were linked, that the two cultures had overlapped and mingled and thus shared important themes and characteristics. According to Machiavelli, the way those cultural traditions were described as being oppositional by European historians had more to do with their imperialistic agenda than with rigorous research. In his monumental study, Machiavelli trace the cultural and artistic exchanges that took place over the course of many centuries between Greece and India. His point of view was that their belief systems were more intertwined and had much more in common than previously thought. For me, however, the shape of ancient thought was more than just about Greece and India. The same claim Machiavelli was making was that particular exchange could be made for other cultural contacts and intertextualities, which are invariably complex but frequently distorted by historical narratives. In that vein, I often state that cultural history is made up from and by all of us. As a non-Western artist, I can use any of it, both Western and non-Western, without being accused of appropriation, as it is all part of our cultural lexicon. In fact, I believe that the reciprocal understanding of each other's cultures is the key to understanding one another, and the only way that progress can be made. To that should be added that such global knowledge cannot be given to us by the latest technologies, but by the open yet critical mindset with which we should use them, not to mention for what and with whom we use them. The exhibition room, All We Imagine is Light, 2017, as presented at the Centre Pompidou, embraces us in a 180-degree setting, including an 11-panel polyptych and 6 tondi. Here I attempt to rewrite the recent conflict history of Kashmir. To this, I was inspired by the verses of the Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali. The panoramic work raises the questions of how conflict is lived and of the disparate accounts of any given conflict, which is very much at the base of many of my works. All We Imagine as Light, a choral painting depicting different moments and scenes, brings us face to face with contemporary history, with the unresolved consequences of the traumatic partition of South Asia. In these reverse painting panels, along with the images, I included lines from Agha Shahid Ali's poem Farewell that form a frieze above the painted images. Your history gets in the way of my memory. I'm everything you lost. You can't forgive me. Agha Shahid Ali's paintings are not written from a single point of view. Instead, they reflect his Hindu, Muslim, and Western heritage. This multifaceted perspective and his respect and understanding of different cultures are conveyed in this special poem, which is not based on abstract observations, but on real accounts. For me, poems like Farewell are imbued with tender hope, and it is precisely the humane tone I find in Ali's poems that is so important for today's world. As far as Kashmir is concerned, I believe we live within man-made political borders that have determined the course of human life for generations. Kashmir was divided when modern-day India and Pakistan were created at the time of their independence from British rule. Unfortunately, certain figures of authority had been given the power to decide who and what we are and will become. Laws, decrees, and abstract concepts don't reflect human suffering, nor do they give a motivation or new angle of thought on how we can transform and improve such imposed conditions and situations. Indeed, my own life has been marked by that obscure and fateful decision to divide Pakistan from India. From the moment I was a year old, my parents and their families fled by boat from Karachi to Bombay. My life has been determined by that political decision made by a few people far removed from the lives of the majority. Similar situations continue to dramatically affect millions of refugees all over the world today. Okay, so what should I do? Stop? There's 5 more slides. How can hate and animosity be accepted as our ruling discourse? How can history be rewritten to support an ideology of confrontation with academic accounts based on fake historical facts? Where can the alternative versions to such manipulation be found? Could they become our history, our future? And now I'm going to show you my animation chamber. I've been asked to hurry up, so I've got 5 more slides. So here we are. In the artwork, can you hear me? The wall and ceilings are painted matte black, on which iPad animations are projected as a dynamic installation that juxtaposes large-scale images and soundtracks in an immersive environment that keeps the audience on their toes. This particular form of installation I call the animation chamber, where one enters my brain with non-synced loops that generate endless new combinations. These were made on the iPad without a stylus. It was like dipping my finger into paint and painting like a child. So I'm going to hurry through this. Most of the animations have only their title as text in the actual work, but with about 10 of these clips, I combine the animated drawings with quotes from authors with whom I have been deeply engaged for decades now. Beckett, Wisława, Szymborska, Veena Das, George Orwell, Milan Kundera, Adrian Rich, Noam Chomsky, Bertolt Brecht, Hannah Arendt. My choice is the provocative quote with a political reference to the current situation. One can see only part of the quote and must wait for the succeeding frames where other parts are revealed to understand the total. The quotes are used to ground my intention, underline their currency, their continued resonance in contemporary situations that I am concerned with and passionately involved with. And the thing is that I get very angry and I don't want to lose my temper, but I do want to make an artwork out of my anger, and this has come out of that. Is there hope for the new Cassandras? Some of these Cassandras, like Greta Thunberg and Arundhati Roy, can be quite loud and not easy to handle, even for global political elites. I believe in a feminist revolution that could be led by women and men with an ear to their inner female voices. 1 Billion Rising is one of these forces, and there are more to come, especially if we include silenced voices of the oppressed and the female. Will mothers cease to be the scapegoats of all societal ills to become the agents of truly progressive change? Thank you.
Questions from the audience?
Oh, we still have time for questions?
Just a couple
thought.
of questions,
Okay.
I know, but we just thought it'd be lovely to
Okay, all right.
ask you a few questions. Just a couple of questions.
I don't think anyone wants to ask questions. They all want to go home.
Yes, please.
Check, check, check. Have you finished with the presentation, or are there any more slides to share?
What?
Say, are we done with the presentation or are there any more slides?
Okay.
She's done? All right, great. So thank you for sharing your brilliant body of work. My question is, so these are in response to the inspirations that you have drawn and the responses that you have given to the events and ideas that you have come across. My question is, do these pieces of inspiration, ideas, events, do they exist today? And what is your take on the present day audience in reaction to your art?
I think they exist today, and I'm only talking about today. I work in contemporary times, and even if I speak about old mythologies, they all have a meaning to me in the contemporary arena. I bring them into the contemporary arena, and my work has to do with what we are going through today. So what is the audience? I mean, I think that different types of audiences take away different things. What's that? For example, in the video shadow plays, I've had little children come in and get fascinated by the shadow plays, and then the parents have a different take. When they slightly move into the shadow play, they see other things happening. I mean, there's instruments of torture, there's waterboarding, there's There's also an image of a woman with a thumbprint on her face. It has to do with what we have to do today to find papers, to just to prove where you come from and where you live and all of that. So that's the kind of audience that comes in.
Question? I think do you visit different places and then put it to art form?
I visit different places through books and through other people's writing that I'm inspired with, and I carry those books with me everywhere. Hamlet Machine and Christa Wolf's Cassandra, I travel with it everywhere. So, you know, it's not traveling to places necessarily, but traveling with books and being with books, you see, and these books live with me. So this is what I actually inspires me. So I just want to say one last thing, if you allow. And my last collaboration was this book that was just sent to me by the publishers. And since this is a lit festival, it's called Ajita by Sridhar. He's a physicist who teaches at the Ashoka University in Bangalore and a brilliant writer and a physicist. So Ajita is the new book, and I've done the cover. I love doing covers. Thank you very much.